They say you don't just marry a person, you marry their whole family. I wish someone had warned me just how true that was before I fell in love with Daniel Chen. I met Daniel at a charity gala in San Francisco 6 years ago. I was there representing my small but growing marketing agency while he was supporting his family's real estate development company. He caught my eye immediately, tall, distinguished in his perfectly tailored suit, but with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. What I didn't realize then was that those same kind eyes would one day be the only thing our daughter Emma inherited from him. Rebecca Zhang. He'd said, reading my name tag with interest. I've heard great things about your work with sustainable businesses. That was Daniel, always noticing the details, always making people feel seen. We talked for hours that night, long after the gala ended, sitting at a quiet bar downtown. He told me about growing up in his traditional Chinese American family, about the weight of expectations being the only son of the mighty Chen family. I shared my dreams of expanding my agency, my passion for helping eco-friendly startups grow. My mother would hate that I'm telling you this on our first meeting, he'd laughed, but I think I'm falling for you already. His mother, Helen Chen. If I'd known then what I know now, I might have run the other direction. But love has a way of blinding us to the red flags, doesn't it? The first year of our relationship was like a fairy tale. Daniel was everything I'd ever dreamed of, supportive, loving, ambitious but kind. He encouraged me to expand my agency, even connecting me with some of his family's business contacts. When he proposed after 14 months of dating, I didn't hesitate to say yes. That's when I got my first real taste of Helen Chen's true nature. A small wedding. She'd scoffed when we announced our engagement. Impossible. The Chens don't do small anything. We'll have at least 300 guests. And of course, you'll wear the traditional dress I wore at my wedding. It's been in the family for generations. I looked at Daniel, hoping he'd support my vision of an intimate ceremony, but he just squeezed my hand and whispered, "It would mean so much to her, honey. And it's just one day." Just one day turned into 6 months of Helen micromanaging every detail of our wedding. The venue I wanted was too modest. The flowers I chose were too simple. The menu I suggested was too Western. Each time I tried to assert myself, she'd remind me about respecting Chinese traditions and honoring the family name. Daniel kept playing peacemaker, always finding ways to compromise. "Mom means well," he'd say. "She just wants everything to be perfect for us." The wedding was exactly what Helen wanted, grand, traditional, and attended by what felt like half of San Francisco's elite. I wore her heavy silk dress, performed all the traditional ceremonies, and smiled through it all. Because I loved Daniel, and I thought that once we were married, things would get easier. I was wrong. The real challenges began when we started trying for a baby. Month after month of disappointment, followed by expensive fertility treatments that left me physically and emotionally drained. Helen's helpful suggestions became increasingly pointed. In my day, women knew their duty was to provide and hear. She'd say during our weekly family dinners, "Perhaps if you weren't so focused on your little business." Daniel would change the subject, but I could see the strain in his eyes. The Chen family legacy weighed heavily on him. After 2 years of trying, multiple failed IVF attempts, and one devastating miscarriage, we started discussing adoption. Adoption. Helen had practically spat the word when we brought it up. The Chen family line cannot be continued by some stranger's child. What will people say? But for once, Daniel stood firm. "Mom, this is our decision. Rebecca and I want a family, and there are so many children who need loving homes." That's how Emma came into our lives. She was 18 months old, with bright eyes and a smile that could light up a room. The moment we saw her photo, we knew she was meant to be ours. The adoption process was long and challenging, but finally, on a bright spring morning, we brought our daughter home. Helen was conspicuously absent from the welcome party our friends threw us. When she finally met Emma 2 weeks later, her reaction was cold enough to freeze the Pacific. "She looks nothing like us," was all she said, barely glancing at our beautiful daughter. Daniel was hurt, but tried to give his mother time to adjust. "She'll come around," he assured me. "Once she gets to know Emma, she'll see what a blessing she is to our family." For the next 3 years, we built our life together. Emma grew into a clever, kind-hearted little girl who inherited Daniel's love of books and my creativity. My agency flourished, expanding to 3 offices along the West Coast. Daniel's work with the family company prospered too, though the long hours and stress sometimes worried me. "I'm fine," he'd insist whenever I suggested he slow down. "The company's expanding and Mom needs me to handle the new developments." I should have pushed harder, should have made him take better care of himself. But you never think the worst will happen to you, do you? You never imagine that a routine business trip will end with 2 police officers at your door at 3 a.m. The private plane carrying Daniel and 2 other executives had gone down in bad weather. There were no survivors. The next few weeks passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, legal meetings, and trying to explain to our 5-year-old daughter why Daddy wasn't coming home. Helen took charge of the funeral arrangements just as she had with our wedding. But this time, her control felt less like help and more like an attempt to erase me from the narrative. The service was conducted entirely in Mandarin, despite Daniel being raised in America. My small contributions, his favorite jazz song, the poems we loved, were dismissed as inappropriate. Even the photos displayed showed mainly Daniel with his parents and business associates. The few with Emma and me were relegated to a small corner. "The Chen family has traditions for mourning," Helen said when I objected. "We must maintain face." I bit my tongue, focused on helping Emma through her grief. My daughter needed me to be strong. I arranged for child therapy, created memory books with photos of Daniel, and tried to maintain as much normalcy as possible in her routine. But Helen had other plans. The summons to the Chen family estate came 3 months after the funeral. Helen insisted it was time to discuss the future of the family business. I should have known something was wrong when I arrived and found not just Helen and her husband George, but also their lawyer and several senior members of the Chen family business board. "Sit down, Rebecca," Helen said, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "We need to talk about what's best for the company, for the family." The next hour was like being trapped in a nightmare. Helen had apparently spent the last 3 months building a case to push me out of my role as Daniel's heir. She cited my lack of experience in real estate, my divided attention with my own business, and most cruelly, my failure to provide a true Chen heir. "The company bylaws are clear," their lawyer droned. "Control must pass to a blood relative. As Daniel's mother and with her extensive experience in the business, Mrs. Chen is the natural choice to assume leadership." I sat there, stunned as they laid out their plans. Not only did they want me to sign over control of the company, but they also expected me to sell back my shares at a family-friendly price, far below market value. And of course, Helen added, her voice dripping with false sympathy, since Emma is, not technically a Chen, she won't be eligible for any future inheritance. It's better to clear these things up now, don't you think? That's when something inside me snapped. "No," I said, standing up. "Absolutely not. Daniel made me his heir for a reason, and Emma is his daughter, adopted or not. He wanted her to inherit everything equally with any future children we might have had." Helen's face hardened. "Be reasonable, Rebecca. You're young. You could remarry, have real children of your own." "Emma? Well, she was a temporary solution to a problem. But now we must think of the Chen family's future." I left that meeting in a daze, Helen's words ringing in my ears. But as I drove home to relieve our nanny and hug my daughter, my shock turned to determination. Daniel had trusted me with his legacy, both the company and our daughter. I wouldn't let Helen erase either of us from his story. What Helen didn't know was that Daniel had seen this coming. 2 weeks before his death, he called me into his home office, looking troubled. "Becca," he'd said, using his special nickname for me, "I need you to record this conversation. For protection. For you and Emma." I'd been confused but did as he asked. That recording, safely stored in my safety deposit box, would change everything. But first, I had to prepare for the battle ahead. The next morning, I made 3 calls, one to my own lawyer, one to a private investigator, and one to Daniel's closest friend and business partner, Michael Wang. The game was on, and Helen Chen was about to learn that she underestimated the wrong mother. The next 2 weeks were a careful dance of preparation and pretense. While Helen thought I was considering her proposal, I was building my case. Michael Wang proved to be an invaluable ally, providing years of documentation showing how Helen had tried to manipulate company decisions in her favor, often against Daniel's wishes. Daniel knew this might happen, Michael told me over coffee, sliding a thick folder across the table. He kept records of everything. Every questionable decision she pushed for, every attempt to undermine his authority. He wanted to protect you and Emma. The private investigator's findings were equally illuminating. Helen's claims about traditional family values looked particularly hollow when matched against evidence of her own past. A first marriage she'd never mentioned, quietly annulled before she met George Chen. A string of questionable property deals in her early years. Most importantly, documentation showing she'd been quietly transferring company assets to accounts only she controlled. But the real smoking gun was Daniel's recording. I waited until my lawyer confirmed we had everything in order before making my move. Helen had scheduled a full board meeting to discuss the company's future direction. She'd even leaked hints to several business publications about an upcoming leadership transition at Chen Developments. The morning of the board meeting, I dressed carefully in one of Daniel's favorite outfits, a crisp black suit he'd said made me look like a CEO. Emma was safely with Sarah and Jim, my in-laws who'd been more real family to us than Helen ever was. "You look like a warrior," my assistant May commented as I gathered my materials. "I feel like one," I replied, checking my briefcase one last time. The recording was there, along with copies of all our evidence. Today we fight for Emma's future. The Chen Development headquarters lobby was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Board members, senior executives, and even a few carefully selected business reporters milled around, all invited by Helen to witness her moment of triumph. Helen's smile when she saw me enter was pure condescension. "Rebecca, dear, I'm so glad you could make it. Have you had time to review those documents we discussed?" "Oh yes," I replied, matching her sweet tone. "I've reviewed everything very carefully." The boardroom filled quickly. Helen had positioned herself at the head of the table, Daniel's old seat, with her lawyer and George flanking her. I took my place halfway down, next to Michael, who gave my hand a reassuring squeeze under the table. "Before we begin," Helen announced once everyone was seated, "I want to thank you all for coming today. As you know, the past few months have been difficult for the Chen family. Losing Daniel," she paused for dramatic effect, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, "has left a void in both our hearts and our company leadership." I watched as she launched into her carefully prepared speech about tradition, family legacy, and the importance of strong, experienced leadership. The board members nodded along, many of them longtime friends of the family who'd watched Daniel grow up. "Which is why," Helen continued, after careful consideration and discussion with Rebecca, "we decided that the best path forward is for me to assume direct control of the company. Rebecca has her own business to manage, after all, and with no true Chen heir." She let that hang in the air, the implication clear. "Do you have anything to add, Rebecca dear?" Helen's smile was triumphant. "Perhaps you'd like to express your support for this transition?" I stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room on me. "Actually, Helen, I do have something to add." I opened my briefcase and removed a small speaker. "I think we should all hear what Daniel had to say about the company's future." The color drained from Helen's face as I pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room, clear and strong, as if he was there with us. "I'm recording this message because I fear for the future of both my family and my company. My mother, Helen Chen, has repeatedly attempted to undermine my authority as CEO. She's pushed for questionable deals, attempted to manipulate board members, and most recently, I've discovered she's been secretly transferring company assets to private accounts." There were gasps around the table. Helen started to stand, but George grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. "But what concerns me most," Daniel's voice continued, "is her treatment of my wife Rebecca and our daughter Emma. She's made it clear she doesn't accept them as true family members. I want this recording to serve as testament to my wishes. Rebecca is to assume control of Chen Developments in the event of my death or incapacity. She has the business acumen, integrity, and vision to lead this company into the future." I paused the recording, letting his words sink in. "There's more," I said into the silence. "Would you like to hear what else your son had to say about you, Helen? About the Marcus Plaza deal? About the offshore accounts?" "You're bluffing," Helen snapped, but her voice shook. "That recording could be fake. The audio has already been authenticated." My lawyer spoke up, distributing folders to each board member. "You'll find the certification in the packets being handed out, along with documentation of Mrs. Helen Chen's unauthorized financial transactions and other relevant evidence." What followed was 2 hours of carefully controlled chaos. Helen alternated between threats, pleading, and attempts to discredit me. But the evidence was overwhelming. By the time Michael presented his documentation of her attempts to undermine Daniel's leadership, even her closest allies on the board were looking at her with disgust. I moved for an immediate audit of all company accounts, one of the senior board members announced. And I suggest Mrs. Helen Chen be suspended from all company activities pending investigation. The vote was unanimous. As security escorted Helen and George from the building, she turned to me, face contorted with rage. "This isn't over. You're nothing but an outsider who seduced my son. You and that adopted brat will never be true Chens." I stepped close to her, keeping my voice low. "You're right about one thing, Helen. Emma and I don't need to be true Chens, because Daniel loved us exactly as we are. He chose us, just as we chose him. That's what real family means." The aftermath was both easier and harder than I expected. The company audit revealed the full extent of Helen's financial manipulations, leading to legal consequences she couldn't charm or buy her way out of. George filed for divorce shortly after, unable to face the social embarrassment of staying married to a woman under investigation for financial fraud. But the hardest part was helping Emma understand why she wouldn't be seeing her grandmother anymore. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked one night as I tucked her into bed. "No, sweetheart," I said, holding her close. "Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices because they're hurting inside, but it doesn't mean we did anything wrong." "Daddy chose us," she said softly, surprising me. "That's what Sarah Mom says. That making a family is about choosing to love each other." I smiled through my tears, thinking of how my former mother-in-law Sarah had stepped up, becoming the grandmother Emma truly deserved. "That's exactly right, baby. Daddy chose us, and we choose to keep loving each other every single day." The next year brought changes I never expected. Under my leadership, Chen Developments launched a major initiative focusing on sustainable urban development, something Daniel and I had often discussed. I established a foundation in his name, providing support for adoptive families and promoting inclusive family values in the Asian American community. Michael became my trusted deputy CEO, his steady presence helping me navigate the challenges of leading a major corporation while raising a daughter alone. The board members who initially viewed me with skepticism became my strongest supporters as they saw how I honored Daniel's vision while pushing the company in new profitable directions. Emma thrived, surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. Sarah and Jim hosted weekly family dinners, creating new traditions that blended their Chinese heritage with our modern family structure. My agency continued to grow under May's capable management, allowing me to focus on Chen Developments and Emma. Last week, Emma came home from school excited about a family tree project. "Look, Mommy," she said, spreading out a large piece of paper. "I put Daddy up here, and you, and Sarah Mom, and Jim Dad, and my auntie, and Uncle Michael." The branches of her tree spread wide and colorful, full of people who had chosen to be family. Looking at it, I remembered Helen's narrow vision of what family should be, and felt grateful that Emma would grow up knowing a different truth. That evening, as I worked in Daniel's old home office, now mine, I found myself talking to him, something I still do sometimes. "You saw it all coming, didn't you?" I said to his photo on my desk. "You knew what she might do, so you left us everything we needed to fight back. But you also taught me that family is about more than blood or traditions or maintaining face. It's about love, about choosing each other every day." Emma poked her head in, already in her pajamas. "Mommy, can we read Daddy's favorite story tonight?" "Of course, baby." I stood taking one last look at Daniel's smiling face in the photo. He'd given us everything we needed, not just the recording or the company, but the courage to stand up for ourselves and the wisdom to know what really makes a family. As I followed Emma to her room, I thought about how life's biggest battles often bring unexpected gifts. I'd lost my husband and fought his mother, but I gained a stronger sense of self, a thriving company, and most importantly, the unshakable knowledge that family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who you choose to love and who chooses to love you back. Emma snuggled into bed, pulling out the worn copy of The Little Prince, Daniel's favorite. As I began to read, I smiled, thinking how he would have loved this moment. In the end, Helen's worst fear had come true. The Chen family legacy had been entrusted to two people who weren't real Chens by her definition. But we were exactly who Daniel chose us to be, the keepers of his love, his values, and his vision for what family could mean. And that, I realized, was the greatest inheritance of all.